Fast, thrilling, fantastic. It's back. Yes, F1 TV Tech Talk is what I'm talking about. It's back for a brand new season. Oh, and Formula One is back for a brand new season as well, 2026, with the biggest rule changes in the sport's history. So it's fair to say there's plenty to talk about. So let's do exactly that and talk about some of the really interesting changes we're seeing on all of the cars up and down the field. In fact, for the first time in many, many years, every single car has something interesting to look at. And it's been that way all the way through pre-season testing. But that's the nature of testing, isn't it? You don't necessarily get to see what a team's really got until they come to the first race, which is now. So let's have a look. And where else to start than, well, with the letter A. And A is for Aston Martin, I guess, rather than Aston Martin's agony. But nonetheless, let's have a look at what's going on down at the green team. Because Aston Martin, it's fair to say, hasn't had the best start to this new era of Formula One and their partnership with Honda, with those really interesting and advanced new power units. And you can just see the top of the Honda power unit poking through the bodywork here. And that in itself tells a little bit of a story. Aston Martin having to go quite conservative on the cooling at the rear of the car, meaning they're running it quite widely open. But the problem is, Aston Martin have found that the Honda power unit has got a bit of a problem with vibration. It's rattling around quite significantly, causing a number of problems, not just for itself as the power unit, but also a number of problems for the wider car, and according to Adrian Newey, for the drivers themselves potentially, which is why we're not really seeing the Aston Martins run at their full capacity. But despite these issues for Aston Martin, it doesn't mean that the team's completely given up on the car. Far from it. There's actually really interesting developments taking place on the Aston Martin. So let's take a look at some of those things that have caught my eye on the Aston Martin in the pit lane in Melbourne. And the first thing I want to draw everybody's attention to, and it's not actually new for Melbourne, it's just we didn't get a really good look from this angle in testing, is the rear leg of the upper wishbone. Now have a look at this. It just comes back so far and it's so sculpted on the Aston Martin. Look how far it comes down and look how low it is mounting onto the monocoque of the car. It's really a big old piece of engineering, that. And you've got to think the forces going through these cars, the forces going through that suspension element, plus its aerodynamic input, that's a really big piece of design. And I know a lot of people have been talking about the rear wishbones, and we are going to take a look at those. But this front wishbone layout is really interesting, particularly when you see it from this angle. And if the car does look a bit funny to you, well, yeah, it is missing something, the nose. We are still seeing this strange characteristic where Aston Martin like to start the car without the nose affixed to it. Not quite sure what that's about yet, but we'll look into that a bit more. But as we move on through the Aston Martin, I mentioned the rear wishbones. Well, let's have a look, because this is what everybody's been talking about. The upper rear wishbone, the rear leg of it. And look how sculpted, I mean, it's a big curved element. Now I remember reading old textbooks at university and things saying you need to have all sorts of straight lines in this part of the car. Apparently nobody told Adrian Newey and his team there, but look at the angle of it. And I know the camera's playing up some of the angles a little bit here, but look at that. It's a big old beautiful piece of sculpting there, and then how it mounts so high up on this extension to the upper surface of the rear crash structure. Normally the rear suspension mounting points will be down here somewhere on the transmission casing, but not so on the Aston Martin. And the other thing to look at is, you've got to remember, hot things have an effect on structures. And if you look where the exhaust tailpipe sits, between these two supporting elements for the rear wing, and those supporting elements, of course, are structural, not just supporting the rear wing, but also your rear suspension. Really doesn't want that to start changing its properties with heat and start flexing in different ways, because it's going to make the car really unpredictable in that sense. So that's something that's going to be really interesting to take an even closer look at. But one thing I do notice is it does look like there is a thermal barrier coating applied to the exhaust tailpipe. Not completely unusual, and a lot of these are based on old nuclear power station technology, using sort of zirconia and all sorts of other ceramic style coatings that go onto those exhaust pipes. So it's something a lot of teams are doing, but it's just quite interesting to see it applied in this way. Now, another thing I want to draw your attention to in this bit of footage here is look at the sculpting on the rear wing end plate. Now, a lot of teams are doing this, but the Aston Martin is absolutely gorgeous. Williams is quite like this as well. Just really, really organic and just a beautiful piece of engineering once again. Sometimes I love these cars because it's not just pure engineering, wind tunnels, all that calculation. In many ways, it's like art and sculpture. And we're going to see a bit more of that sculpture as we work through the rest of the car and the rest of the field as well. Aston Martin's rear wing here looking like it's been attacked by a bunch of, chain stores in certain parts of the USA. But these Target logos are not Target logos at all. They are optical contacts to check for rear wing flex, and there's an awful lot of them dotted about the rear wing just so the teams and the FIA can keep an eye on what's going on. You can also see just how exposed the rear wing active aerodynamics actuator is, and we're going to see, I suspect, quite a lot of development on the Aston Martin and every other car in the pit lane in this area. Of course, I am sort of saving the best for last. Now here's the rear corner of the floor of the Aston Martin, and this is going to be one of the biggest areas of development this season, as an awful lot of teams are working on managing the airflow as it comes up on the inner face of the rear wheel, which you can just see, well, you can see very clearly here. And now this gap, this what some people are calling mouse holes or rodent holes, well, what all of this seems to be to do with is not quite sealing, because that's a bit too simplistic, but managing the airflow on the inner edge of the diffuser to try to prevent all sorts of nasty sort of, I guess you'd call them vortexes, coming off the bottom of the tyre here into the diffuser volume and robbing all that lovely downforce and carefully managed airflow in there. Now, there used to be a rule in Formula One when these bits of floor and these cutouts on the edge of the floor first started to appear, and we're talking quite a long time ago. A lot of teams were trying to exploit the regulations which stated the edges of the floor must be single and continuous, which meant you're not allowed to have any holes in. But some teams were being a little bit clever, and they were putting little slits on the edge of the floor like that, linking the hole to the edge, and it was almost like the width of a piece of paper, bare, not even a millimetre of a hole, to say, no, that's single and continuous, it's just the edge goes in and out like that and there's lots of cuts in it. They were exploiting the regulations, it's fair to say. Well, under the 2026 rules, that single and continuous rule doesn't really exist. You've got these proper holes once more. However, they're not all holes. You come forward here, as you can see, it is still a little slit that comes in, but further down there's a link section, which means that is a hole by the regulations, because that link section counts as a bit of bodywork, but the forward one, not so much. But what I really like to see is the amount of sculpting there is on these rear corners. I'm going to look at quite a few of those as the season goes on. But you can see Aston Martin have introduced a major change here, and that's going to be a big bit of work to change that, because there's a lot of aerodynamics going on. But that's not the only really clever change on the Aston Martin. Have a look at this. This is a fairly standard leading edge of the floor. This is the Mercedes we're looking at here. And you're looking at this section here, just leading in on the front of the floor, and you've got a pretty flat top surface that's pretty tightly defined in the regulations. Not a lot of freedom there, is there? Aston Martin though didn't get that memo. They've cut down, and this is really clever, they've sculpted out the leading edge of the floor just on the top surface to give themselves a little bit more volume, and into that volume you've got two little vertical aerodynamic elements that look like they're sort of outwashing a little bit. I mean, whether they actually are, I mean, it looks pretty clear, but whether they actually are, you need a wind tunnel in the CFD. We've been down that road before. But this is a really clever and really interesting upgrade on the car. The fact they're introducing it in a race that they know they're not going to finish, that in itself is pretty surprising, and it shows you how much more Aston Martin have got to come. But I love this little upgrade. I think everybody else on down the pit lane will be taking a very good look at this, because how much more development can you do in this area? Aston Martin opening up an area of freedom that nobody else has yet exploited. But speaking of areas of freedom that people haven't exploited, Ferrari, who have, well, they've got quite a lot of attention in pre-season testing, haven't they? It's fair to say, and well, they are an interesting car to look at. And what's really grabbed a lot of people's attention so far in pre-season testing is this plate sort of element that sits behind the exhaust tailpipe. Now in testing, they did run it, we did all notice it, but this is the first opportunity we've all had to get a really close look at its design and its installation. And I actually think they may have modified it on the run up to Melbourne. But having a look from some of the other angles we've now got available, have a look at this. It is really quite intricate, but really quite amazing. It's sort of like blocking most of the exhaust pipe. This is the exhaust tailpipe here. You can see very clearly. Interesting piece of design, fairly standard. Every car's got them and they're all in the same position by regulation. But Ferrari have got this plate here that is very clearly blocking the majority of the exhaust. And it's not just pushing it out to the sides. They've got these extra plates, which I don't think we really saw clearly in testing, that stop the exhaust gases from going out either to the side, and I suspect there's one at the bottom. So it's making sure all of the exhaust gases just come out of here and go scooting off upwards. And we've seen that on some of the footage of the car on track in testing, how you can see the exhaust plume going almost vertically out of the rear of that Italian car. And when you see it here, it just reminds me of almost like an old Thomas the Tank Engine episode, where you might see a steam train in there that's been bricked in a rather cruel punishment for not behaving well enough. Blast from the past. And have a look at the design of this. It does look like some little screw heads have gone missing in Ferrari's preparation, but this footage was taken during the session before free practice, so it's quite possible they hadn't finished bolting the thing together. But it does look like someone's left a few screw heads out of there, doesn't it? But nonetheless, it just is quite amazing. I just felt that that might create a bit of back pressure into the exhaust system, or change the mass flow out of the main tailpipe, but it's just fascinating. And one of the reasons it's very hard to copy is this regulation, this zone of freedom in the regulations is related, as I understand it, to the differential positioning in the Ferrari transmission. And there's only one other team in the field that really can easily take advantage of that, and that's Haas, who used the exact same package as Ferrari. So I think 3-2-1, and we'll see one of these on the white painted car pretty soon, though the Haas does have a very different aerodynamic concept to Ferrari this year, so it will be interesting to watch it. But the other thing you can see in this footage here is how this plate element actually fares into the rest of the structure around the top of the rear impact structure, and that's something I don't think, again, we really got a good look at in testing. So really just taking a detailed look at this design, and it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Well, as we move on to the rear of the Ferrari, we can see there's been a slight change here to this element on the upper edge of the outer part of the diffuser. They've revised this section on the top of the stack of elements here, and also this lovely little metal vertical element. Big yellow arrow pointing at it as well. Can't think what to call it. Anyway, moving on, we look at the rear floor of the car here. This is the Mercedes, another solution to that rear floor engineering. Now, we have seen some teams create double-decker elements at the rear. Mercedes just with a very remote element sitting out here, but I love this long forward section, drawing the air in, and then a little sort of link section. It's almost like someone's done some highway tunnel digging there, but it's really just the level of work going into here and how different all the teams are making this part of the floor. Really going to be a huge amount of change this season on all of those parts. You can also see a very interesting little element coming down from the back of the diffuser here, but also all of these elements here. Look at this just little sculpting on the inner edge of the floors. All of these cars, they're wonderfully fascinating, aren't they? There's so much to go on. I'm not going to be able to get through all of this in this episode, actually. I've already worked that out, and there's producers behind the camera telling me to hurry up, and I'm not going to. I'm just going to get on with it. This is something else we saw in testing, the little additional elements on the Mercedes rear wing. And again, this is the first chance we've had to have a really good look at it. And now we can take some scale as well off the mechanic's hand. And you can see here, and this is something I didn't spot in testing, how it's almost a twin element, this little vertical or extra element of the wing. And it really is an extra element of the wing. These are wing sections with little gurney flaps along the top edge of them as well. And there's a split here because that's the section of the wing that moves with the active aero. That section doesn't. So there's actually two extra bits on the top of the wing. And you can see it from behind quite clearly. You can see that split and how they sit at a slightly different level to one another. And that's just really, really creative interpretation of the regulations. And that's the wonderful thing about new rules. The FIA has spent a lot of time writing these regulations. The teams have spent a lot of time studying the regulations. And there's more people in the teams than there are in the FIA, which means more brains and probably a few ideas the FIA possibly hadn't considered. Finally, I'm moving through these cars as quick as possible. The other thing that jumped out to me, and this is something I didn't spot in testing again, and this is just looking at the Cadillac, the rear end of the Cadillac. Now, we've seen these slits on the bodywork, very much Ferrari style, but have a look, see if you spot this here, because I didn't spot this in testing, and the rear bodywork doesn't make it easy because of the way Cadillac have painted their car in a sort of dazzle ship livery. Did you spot that? I'll play it again. Firstly, the car is asymmetric at the rear. It's not the same on either side. But if you look at this section here, look at the bodywork. Now, I thought at first this was just a bit of paint job, but it's not. There is a big old hole there, the back of the cooling outlet. Yeah, sure. Nothing too surprising there. But when I show you that lower section from a different angle, you might start to notice what I was noticing. And this shot, rear wing. That's what I wanted the cameraman to look at. That's what we got a shot of. Let's just have a look at the Cadillac rear wing. But down here, I noticed something. You can see the bodywork isn't properly attached here in the corner. It seems to be dropping down actually quite deliberately, and I'm just beginning to wonder, it's not just that the bodywork isn't properly fitted, is there a little extra inlet on the top of the Cadillac bodywork? Going to have a closer look at that, because yes, clearly the bodywork isn't fully bolted together, this section here, but when you look at it in this shot, is it just sitting up a bit proud? What does that look like? They've sculpted it that way. Curious, and something we'll have to take a closer look at. And that really underlines how much detail there is to study, because every time I look at one of these cars, I start to notice something else that I haven't noticed or thought about or considered. In this case, it might just be some poorly fitted bodywork, but mostly I think every part of these cars has got innovation upon innovation, design upon design, and my word, it's going to be December before we get through all of this. I can't wait.